I was recently at a closed-door security briefing in Berlin, watching a room full of people who usually pride themselves on being the most rational, level-headed voices in European policy. The official topic was strategic autonomy, but the atmosphere felt less like a diplomatic debate and more like a group of people realizing they'd left their front door wide open just as a storm started to howl. One senior official, a woman who has spent her entire career as a staunch advocate for a nuclear-free Europe, was staring intensely at a map showing the reach of Russian missile batteries. Usually, she is the first to shut down any talk of military escalation with a lecture on humanitarian values. But when a speaker mentioned the latest shift in American sentiment, the growing possibility that the U.S. might simply stop answering the phone when Europe calls for help, her posture completely changed. She didn't offer a rebuttal or talk about peace treaties. Instead, she leaned forward and asked a single, quiet question that cut through the room. If the Americans leave, who exactly holds the key to the French silos? It was a jarring reversal. The very person who viewed nuclear weapons as a barbaric relic was suddenly, almost desperately, looking at them as the only thing standing between her world and a total collapse of order. But as the conversation shifted to the logistics, to the idea of a European Strategic Nuclear Agency or a committee in Brussels having a say in a launch decision, the room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The look on her face said it all. The sheer intellectual whiplash of realizing that the moral high ground of disarmament is a very lonely place when you're no longer standing under someone else's umbrella. It forced a question that feels like it belongs in a Cold War thriller, but is quickly becoming our new reality. Can 27 different nations with 27 different histories ever actually trust each other enough to share a single nuclear trigger?
Yeah, I mean, the gravity of that scenario, it perfectly captures the precipice that Europe is standing on today.
Right, it's not just theory anymore.
Exactly. The prospect of actually building a European nuclear deterrent, in the face of this uncertain U.S. umbrella and a rising Russian threat, has become a very real conversation. And that's really the mission of our deep dive today.
Yeah, to figure out how this would actually work.
Right, to explore the mechanical, the legal, and the geopolitical realities of Europe trying to build its own nuclear deterrent.
Because before 27 nations can even share a physical trigger, they first have to navigate this massive maze of international law. Laws that were ironically designed specifically to prevent the sharing of nuclear weapons in the first place.
Yeah, it's a huge hurdle.
There's actually the story about a veteran Brussels diplomat, well, let's just call him Elias. So Elias was navigating this grueling late-night session on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and he's basically caught between two extremes. On one side, you have a pacifist Nordic state, and on the other, a very nervous Baltic nation.
A classic European divide, really.
The pacifists were arguing that any sort of collective nuclear framework completely destroys the NPT's moral fabric, but the Baltic minister shot back, saying, morality is a luxury for those who don't actually share a border with a nuclear-armed aggressor.
That's a very harsh reality check.
Right, and Elias realized they weren't just debating policy, they were debating if 27 vastly different histories could somehow share one future. So he proposed this political control clause.
Which is a classic diplomatic maneuvering.
Exactly. It was this masterpiece of legal ambiguity. It didn't fully satisfy anyone, but it protected both sides. It really highlights how these legal challenges are often just desperate attempts to keep a fractured under one roof.
Yeah, and to understand Elias's challenge, you have to look at the actual legal mechanics of the NPT, what analysts call the NPT's Gordian knot. It all comes down to Articles 1 and 2. So Article I strictly prohibits nuclear weapon states from transferring weapons or control over them to anyone.
Okay.
And then Article 2 prohibits non-nuclear states from receiving those weapons or control. Seems pretty airtight on paper, right?
Right. But, looking at the current setup, there's clearly ambiguity there. What does transfer actually mean? Because right now, the U.S. has weapons sitting in vaults in Belgium, Germany, Italy.
Exactly.
Does stationing them there count? Or, what about when Allied military personnel train during NATO's annual Steadfast Noon exercise? Does that count as a transfer?
Well, this is where NATO's legal argument comes in. They argue that a transfer only happens if physical custody is actually handed over. Since the U.S. maintains physical custody during peacetime, they argue their practices are totally compliant.
It's honestly like a really strict property lease. Well, the landlord, the nuclear states, lets the tenant, the non-nuclear states, hold the keys and live in the house. But the landlord insists the deed hasn't actually changed hands.
That's actually a great analogy.
If the NPT supposedly doesn't apply during wartime, which is what some people argued during the Cold War to justify this, doesn't that make the treaty completely useless when it actually matters most?
Exception. The treaty actually is meant to apply during wartime.
Really?
Yeah. Article X of the NPT contains a specific withdrawal clause. It says a state has to give 3 months' notice if extraordinary events jeopardize its supreme interests.
Wow.
So the fact that there's a formal withdrawal process proves the framework doesn't just vanish when shots are fired.
Yeah.
You have to legally withdraw, which just deepens the whole legal knot for Europe.
Okay, so the legal loopholes are one thing on paper, but executing them in a subterranean bunker is a completely different reality.
Entirely.
How does a union actually share the physical mechanism of a bomb without violating all those laws we just talked about?
Well, it comes down to the mechanics of shared control and something called the double key system. There's this fascinating story of a secret run a simulation for a dual authorization protocol.
Okay.
You have a French military technician and a German political liaison sitting in a reinforced bunker. The technician holds the physical French key, right? The actual launch capability.
Right.
And the German holds the political key, which represents a collective EU Council decision.
So they both have to turn them.
Exactly. So in the simulation, the order comes down, and then there are 5 minutes of deafening silence.
Eternity.
The technician is just sitting there waiting, but the German liaison is staring at a screen, waiting for a committee of distant politicians to actually vote. So the physical power is ready to go, but the political will is just trapped in bureaucracy. It really raises this chilling question. Does your security come from the weapon itself, or from the trust between the people holding the keys?
Fine.
Yeah. And to see how this works in the real world, look at NATO's current system. The U.S. keeps custody of the weapons, but host nations provide what are called dual-capable aircraft, or DCA.
Right. The planes that actually drop them.
Yeah. But it works differently depending on where you are. Like, Italian forces are tasked with delivery at Getty Air Base, so they possess what's basically a practical veto. If they refuse to fly the planes, the strike doesn't happen.
They just don't take off.
But contrast that with weapons at Aviano in Italy or in Sirlik in Turkey. Yeah. Those are designated for American delivery. So the U.S. has unilateral flexibility there.
Okay, so this brings up a huge issue. To keep an alliance of 27 countries happy, you need consensus, right?
Right.
But to actually scare an adversary, you need credibility. The enemy has to believe you'll pull the trigger.
It's the core dilemma.
And that bunker story highlights the fatal flaw. If an incoming hypersonic missile takes, 5 minutes to arrive, a Democratic committee vote is literally a death sentence.
It's way too slow.
It's like having a fire extinguisher locked in a glass case. But before you can break the glass, you need a 27-person jury to agree that there's a fire. By the time they vote, the building's gone.
That is the exact fire extinguisher dilemma Europe is wrestling with. If the mechanics of shared control are this slow and legally messy, it forces us to ask, why is Europe even having this conversation right now?
Right. And I think it comes down to the border reality. Think about a family living near the Suwałki Gap, right on the border of Poland and Lithuania.
A very tense area right now.
So the father of this family, he actually remembers the Berlin Wall falling. Yeah. And for his whole adult life, he's viewed the American bases nearby as his ultimate insurance policy.
Yeah.
But lately, watching the news, seeing the shifts in U.S. politics, and hearing all the America First rhetoric, he tells his daughter that the American umbrella is leaking.
Wow, leaking. That's a powerful way to put it.
And when he hears people talking about a European nuclear deterrent, he doesn't protest it. He just feels this grim sense of growing up. Like, he realizes Europe has to stop being a child living in a distant relative's house and start building its own walls, even if those walls are nuclear.
It's a huge psychological shift.
But the danger is that rushing to build this European fortress might accidentally dismantle the very transatlantic structures that have kept the peace for decades.
Right. And just to be clear for you listening, as we dig into these geopolitical realities, we're just reporting on the strategic assessments from our sources, not taking any political sides here.
Exactly. We're just looking at the facts on the ground.
So the sources outline two major external shocks driving this fear. First, obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and their nuclear posturing, like moving weapons into Belarus.
Yeah, impossible to ignore.
And second, what experts are calling the Trump shock, basically. The transactional nature of recent U.S. foreign policy and the uncertainty it creates. This creates a deterrence gap.
Meaning the adversary stops believing the threat.
Yes. It's not just the fear of a sudden U.S. withdrawal, it's the gradual erosion of credibility. If Russia thinks the U.S. might hesitate, it invites probing.
So what are Europe's actual options here? Because it sounds like a menu of bad choices.
Yes. The Munich Security Conference laid out a few structural options. Option A is just to double down on the U.S.
Which is getting increasingly risky, given what we just talked about.
Right. Then there's option B, rely on the independent arsenals of France and the UK. France has about 290 warheads. The UK has roughly 225.
But neither of them wants to give up sovereignty over their trigger.
They won't hand over control. So Europe would have to rely on them promising to use their weapons to defend everyone else.
See, I have to jump in on option B. Because is trading Washington for Paris really a viable solution?
It's heavily debated.
I mean, do families in the Suwalki Gap actually trust that a French president would sacrifice Paris to save Warsaw?
And that right there is the ultimate friction point. Extended deterrence only works if the protector is genuinely willing to risk their own homeland for an ally.
Right.
During the Cold War, the question was, would the U.S. trade New York for Berlin? Now the question is about Paris and Warsaw. It's a massive leap of trust.
Okay, so what's option C?
Option C is a true Euro deterrent. But how do you manage it? If it's intergovernmental, you need a coalition vote, 27 leaders on a Zoom call while a missile is flying.
Which goes back to the fire extinguisher problem, total paralysis.
Right. Or you make it supranational. You delegate the launch authority to an EU official in Brussels.
Oh, I can't imagine sovereign nations agreeing to that. Handing the power to start a nuclear war to an unelected committee.
Exactly. It's practically unthinkable right now,
Right.
which leaves option D, proliferation.
Like states just building their own bombs.
Yeah, like Poland or Germany developing their own nuclear weapons.
But wait, isn't that incredibly illegal?
Highly illegal. Under the NPT, yes. But for Germany specifically, it's prohibited by the 2+4 agreement from 1990. They permanently renounced nuclear weapons to get reunification.
So option D is basically blowing up international law entirely.
Much.
So distilling all of this, the legal ambiguity, the bunker delays, the border anxieties, it becomes really clear that the physical hardware of a nuclear deterrent is only a fraction of the equation.
Right, the submarines, the planes, the warheads, none of that matters without the political unity, the legal frameworks backing it up. The true deterrent is the unwavering trust required to make an adversary actually believe the trigger will be pulled.
The era of strategic complacency in Europe has permanently ended. The psychological safety net of the Cold War has been dismantled. Going forward, the burden of preventing a nuclear catastrophe on the continent will no longer be dictated by shifting political winds in Washington, but by Europe's own willingness to look directly at the darkest machinery of war and take ownership of the keys.